On behalf of the USC School of Architecture Graduate Program in Heritage Conservation, I want to welcome everyone to the Modernism at Risk panel discussion and exhibit. We are happy to present this in partnership with two organizations, Docomomo SoCal, which is the new Southern California chapter of Docomomo US, recently formed here, and we are pleased to be their partner to present this evening's event, but also the World Monuments Fund. The exhibit that is next door in Watt Hall is courtesy of their efforts and sponsored by Knoll as well. So thank you to both of them for making this whole event possible. We've had a big year this year in the Heritage Conservation Program, and a couple of the highlights include working on a HABS documentation of the Eames House in partnership with the Historic Preservation Education Fund and the Getty Conservation Institute, as well as the Eames Foundation. Site visits to some local projects that are happening. For the first time ever, we've held a class at the Gamble House talking about historic site stewardship, and our students presented as panelists for the California Preservation Conference in Anaheim this last year. We also recently were very delighted to be the beneficiaries of a generous gift from our longtime adjunct faculty member, Peyton Hall, who has been a supporter of the program for many years and has been teaching our materials conservation course. He is the managing principal of Historic Resources Group, one of the local conservation firms in Los Angeles, and his efforts have been really remarkable in the preservation of the city. We are grateful to have received a gift from him to name one of the offices upstairs, actually the director's office, and from here on out it's going to be known as Peyton Hall, which I think makes good sense. In addition, here on campus, we've had some notable events, including the recent designation of several local landmark designations, historic cultural monument designations for some of the buildings on the USC campus as part of the campus master plan process, including the Olin Hall of Engineering by Pereira and Associates from 1963, the Von Kleinschmidt Center by Edward Durrell Stone, the University Religious Center by Killingsworth Brady and Associates, which was a particularly threatened building in the most recent master planning process. In addition to the Annenberg School for Communication by A. Quincy Jones and Associates, which is actually from 1979, but is really a pretty fantastic building. So that is big news and recent news here in LA. So the other exciting thing this year is that for the next year or so, we're going to be celebrating the 100 years of architecture at USC. It was in fact 100 years ago that the first classes were held. The school wasn't created until a few years later, but the first classes in architecture were about 100 years ago. And so it's great we're going to be spending the next year sort of looking at that legacy, but also looking forward to the next 100 years and what will come, what will be the legacy of the school for the next 100 years. So that's kind of exciting. We also have an event next week, which is the university has a program called Visions and Voices, which we are happy to partner with them to put forward a program about Paul Revere Williams, who was a student here at USC in the early years, and it was really an incredibly prominent architect here in Los Angeles. Also was the first African American to be a member of the AIA, and so but really had a legacy here in Los Angeles that spanned from the 20s until the 60s in terms of his practice, and so has had a very significant impact on the built environment. So we're going to be talking about that as well. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for that event. We also have exciting news that we are going to be launching in the fall a new dual degree program with the Price School of Policy and Planning, which is dual degree Master of Heritage Conservation and Master of Planning. So we're ironing out the details now, but we look forward to launching that officially in the fall, and we hope that you will spread the word with us. In talking about modernism, there's a lot to talk about. Modernism is clearly at risk, as you can see here from the Moore House in Palos Verdes Estates, which was recently demolished. That we are always fighting this battle to save resources. And while we've made a good case for buildings from the 50s, we have a little bit more work to do when it comes to buildings from the 60s and 70s. But even still, we have some pretty well-known architectural examples that we have lost in recent years that have really pointed the way towards the fact that that we have a lot of work left to do. So what we wanted to talk about today is some issues that relate to the conservation of modern resources. Why is it hard? What's so difficult about it? Here is the LAX theme building, which actually was recently rehabbed, and because a piece of it fell off, but it was recently rehabbed and is now the exterior shell is in very good shape, but the restaurant recently closed, and so there is some question mark about what the future of this amazing, iconic landmark building in the heart of the airport, what will be its future. In addition, the demolition of Prentice Hospital in Chicago was a watershed moment for many in preservation, thinking about modern architecture and particularly brutalist architecture and what does that mean as we move forward. We have this was a very uphill battle to try and preserve and protect this building, and ultimately we lost. It's now been demolished. And it was a real call to arms about the recent past and how do we create a constituency and help people understand what can be tricky and difficult buildings, but also buildings that are significant when they're first created and lose that momentum as time goes on. So another really sort of pressing example at the moment is the Houston Astrodome, which recently a part of it was demolished, although the main stadium is still intact, which is an amazing building that is a superlative on many fronts, including that it was the first of its kind, has many levels of cultural and architectural significance, as well as actually engineering significance, given the unique nature of the dome and the fact that it was a precedent for most sports stadiums that came after it was built in 1965. And so we want to talk about some of those issues tonight with our esteemed panelists. So on our panel this evening, I'd like to welcome Adrian Scott Fine, who is the Director of Advocacy at the Los Angeles Conservancy, Christina Morris, who is the Field Office Director for the National Trust for Historic Preservation here in Los Angeles, Kyle Normandin, who is the Senior Project Specialist for the Getty Conservation Institute and actually is heading up the Conserving Modern Architecture Initiative for the Conservation Institute. And then I'm going to participate as the moderator for the panel. So with that being said, I'd like to invite our panelists up to the stage.
Part of what prompted this was, of course, the exhibit across the way. And one of the things that is sort of a question that I think many people have, which I thought would be a good place to start off for you all. So ready? Which is sort of, what is modernism? Modernism with a capital M, modernism with a little m, Is modernism the 20th century resources, or is it only things after World War II? And I'm sure I can see many of you have an opinion on this already. But I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are on that. So, Adrian, I'm going to put you on the spot first.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, the question is, what is modernism? There is no right answer here. So I think it's a little bit of everything, and how you define it and what you care about. I mean, a lot of us working in this field for some time have thought about, at least in my opinion, have thought about modernism being, post-war and moving forward. And I think in a strict sense that's probably true, that you're working on. But things from, like when the Ennis House was built, that was modern. So I think people have a broader scale in terms of what they may fall into that. It's also whether it's modernism defined just around architecture or modernism defined around cultural events that took place. So it's a range of things. And then you get into the whole issue of recent past or familiar past that you're dealing with. And a good example, I think, of that most recently that's been up for debate in West Hollywood with Tower Records. I think is a really interesting case and a sticky and challenging discussion about what is worth preserving, but what is, modern and tells a story of a place and that we should care about. And if it doesn't look like what it was when it was something we cared about, is it still important? So I think we'll get into that, but that's my broad answer.
Anybody else want to tackle that?
Sure.
Anybody want to argue with him?
Sure, no, not at all. I would agree entirely. I think even looking at the exhibit earlier, one of the things that was quite evident and clear was that early on in the 20th century, there was a celebration of technology. And I think that for a lot of the folks, for example, that are involved in Docomomo, looking at modernism through the lens of the early part of the 20th century and looking at the technological implications for how it was proliferated in architecture is a very interesting concept. It's not only about the physical manifestation of the materiality and use of building systems, but it also is about how culture embraced technology in the light of that. So I would agree with that statement entirely, and I think the understanding that I have, just based on my involvement with Docomomo and Icamos over the last 20 years, is really through that lens. Docomomo spends a lot of time really looking at early modernism and how it evolved over the 20th century, and then, of course, how it sort of manifests itself after the post-war era. So there's a lot of examples about how that exists, and I think that we'll get into that in this discussion, hopefully, in the panel today.
So modernism is a state of mind.
It could be.
Yes. Okay. So is it harder to save modern resources, or is it the same as saving any building from any era? Is it all the same tools? Is it more challenging for different reasons? Maybe you can, Chris, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Dive into that one. I guess this is something, obviously, that I've been struggling with a lot recently, and that I think our organization has been struggling with a lot recently. And my perception of it is that we really are kind of fighting the same battles over and over again. It's sort of the same story, just in a different place, and maybe with different labels on it. And kind of getting back to your question earlier of defining modernism, I find that in some ways we're still struggling with the labels, and maybe the labels aren't that helpful, or that the labels are kind of getting in the way, which I know is something that many other people have said before me. But I think one of the things that we found is that the challenges aren't really around like the tools that you use or the battles that you're fighting. It's really around people's perceptions of the resources. But that in and of itself isn't unique either. I mean, as we all know, this is very cyclical, and so we're just facing many of the same challenges that other people have faced in earlier periods around different architectural styles. So I don't know that I would necessarily say that we're fighting this in a different way, but I think maybe we need to be thinking about not so much how do we fight modernism battles differently, but maybe how we fight preservation battles differently, and learning some of the lessons that we have learned in maybe some of the recent losses and wins that we've had around modern structures, because that's where the front lines are these days.
if I could just add to that, you mentioned that people and perceptions. I think what that is one distinction is we're a part of the problem, in part because we live longer, and so the other thing is that we're talking about buildings that a lot of us grew up with or remember when they were built. It's where we shopped. It's our familiar. We know these places, and for some people, it's really hard to get your arms around that they're now potentially historic. And I think there are some nuances. I totally agree that I think the tools, and it's really not all that different in terms of when we're talking about an 1870s building that's threatened versus a 1957 building. But there are some nuances that are attached to these buildings that make it a little bit more challenging. I think one of those is these aren't necessarily pretty buildings. Which gets at, I think, what a lot of we've dealt with.
Some of them aren't.
It depends on the beholder, but I think in some ways they're aesthetically challenged buildings for the general populace in understanding they're not warm and fuzzy for a lot of people. They're, brutal is brutal. It's a lot of concrete, and it may not, capture your, strong feelings. And I think the other thing is that a lot of these buildings came about at a time when the preservation movement was just getting underway. So they may have resulted as part of demolition of an older era of building. So they have the baggage and stigma attached to that, again, some people still remember when they were built and what was lost at that time. So I think there are some added aspects that make it a little more challenging sometimes. And then when we're talking about buildings that are not maybe architecturally distinctive, but important culturally, it's harder to kind of dig deeper to get people to embrace why they're significant and why they're important in keeping.
See, I would actually kind of challenge that a little bit because I understand exactly what you're saying, that oftentimes things are too close, and so people have, that whole notion of it can't be historic because that would mean I'm historic, immediate sort of instinctive reaction to it. Right, which I still am having a hard time wrapping my head around because I'm older than Prentice Women's Hospital. That never bothered me, that never occurred to me. But I think what I'm also finding in dealing with people, particularly more around the recent past or things that aren't necessarily known for their architectural significance, that people will often have very strong connections to those specifically because they did grow up with them and because they do have associations with them. I mean, people love the Astrodome, I think, as much because of what happened there and because of the experiences that they had there as they did for the architecture, or maybe even more so. So I don't necessarily think that it's always a bad thing that these things are so close. I think in many ways we should be capitalizing more on their closeness to us. And some people find it off-putting, but we need to find ways to turn that around into a much more immediate and emotional connection to the place. At least that's my take on it.
And I would probably just add one more thing to that, and that is that, we're constantly having to deal with the aesthetic criteria and the passage of time. That oftentimes our buildings develop patinas, and those patinas are very different from when the building was first built. And so people's perception of them at the point of their construction is very different from where they end up today. So as curators of the built world, we have to be cognizant of that and to kind of bring that into the discussion a little bit because it's complicated, as you can see with the different levels of understanding that both Adrian and Chris just mentioned.
Well, so I'm going to tease that out a little bit further, which is to say that there's a lot of discussion about materiality in conservation and about how historic fabric is really important to save. And then there is another camp of people here in Los Angeles and elsewhere who believe that for modern buildings, the materials are not as important, and it really is the design of a space. And so if you take out the historic fabric, but you build it just the way that Neutra designed it, and you replicate the building, that is conservation. And there are a few people here in LA who firmly espouse that belief, who shall remain nameless. But I'm curious your thoughts on that. If we were to talk about the same kind of treatment for the Gamble House, that it's okay to take all the wood out of the Gamble House and replace it, you would have a lot of people laying their bodies down in front of the screwdrivers to prevent that from happening. But The same has not necessarily been the case when we're talking about some of the case study houses here in Los Angeles and things like that. So is materiality different for modern resources than it is for something from, say, the turn of the century?
I think you have to look at that very carefully, and I think you have to take it on a case-by-case basis. I would argue that with the increasing understanding of what our 20th century resources are, there's a growing appreciation for authenticity and the spirit of place. So those kinds of ideas are, the underpinnings of that is really about looking at the values of a place more than it is about the materiality of it. I think that you have to balance your decision making when you go into a project. Not every project's going to be able to be conserved in such a way that you're able to retain all of the material authenticity, for example. Some cases you will. I think, in the work that we're doing now with the research in our program, I think, the idea is that we balance as much material retention as possible. So it's, you have to really careful. You have to be very careful. It's not an either-or situation. I think you have to look at each example on a case-by-case basis.
It's something that I've thought about quite a bit, actually. Particularly, a trip to Japan sort of drove it home for me because it's a completely, I think that perspective is much closer to the one that you're describing as the lattermost, where it's really about the place itself and sort of what happens in the place, and you're looking at the third, fourth, sometimes 10th generation of that building that's been completely reconstructed, and that's not necessarily an issue because it's about what happens there rather than what it is. Which is certainly something that I can appreciate. I don't know that we're necessarily ready for that, but I can understand that mindset. But I think it's really interesting that I feel like there's sort of a little bit of a double standard because I spend a lot of my time in Oak Park, Illinois, which, that's where Unity Temple is. For those of you who don't know Unity Temple, it's Frank Lloyd Wright's one of his best-known ecclesiastical buildings. And that building was completely recovered. You are seeing very little, if anything, on the exterior of that building that's authentic or original. That's in large part because of what we're seeing, in what we think of as a 20th century problem, but I think it's endemic to a lot of Wright buildings too. Just the construction issues were such that there was no way to preserve that building in its original form. It was either take it down and rebuild it or totally encapsulate it. And so sometimes it really is. I agree with you completely. It's case by case because each instance is going to have its own particular set of circumstances, and you kind of have to weigh the benefits of what are we really preserving, what are we ultimately left with, and what is it that really is most important to us about this particular place. And I think, timely, the sort of the discussion around the Folk Art Museum in New York and sort of this heart-wrenching process that they've gone through and the decision that they've made about taking the building down because they felt like there wouldn't be enough integrity left in its repurposed. I'm not saying that I necessarily agree with that perspective, but I think it really kind of highlights this whole issue of what is it that we're really valuing and what is going to be authentic in terms of what's actually left of the piece of architecture that we're dealing with.
I think there's also a temporal quality to materials. In the 20th century, we had a lot of new innovation behind the fabrication and innovation of materials. We're just beginning to really kind of understand, how those materials weathered over time, what their lifespans were, what their weatherability was like, and it's something that still needs to be worked out. I think obviously we have, the building stone of the 20th century, which is concrete, is obviously in some cases of very poor quality, but in some cases it's very durable and still lasting, in some of the more iconic buildings that we have. So again, it's not across the board, but I do think what happened is early on when buildings weren't performing like those of traditional construction, a lot of people took the liberty to just change out materials at random. And this was done in order to kind of maintain the design intent over time. But I think now with people really kind of understanding more and more about what those materials are doing, whether it be plastics, wood, glass, that there's sort of a little bit more of a balancing act. People are sort of looking at buildings. What do we retain? What can we retain? What is the chroma? What is the original appearance like? How's that changed over time? What's important to people? What's important to culture? There's a huge matrix of things to think about with regards to an approach for how you conserve a building from the 20th century.
So why don't we do you want to talk a little bit about the Conserving Modern Architecture initiative and what it is and what you're trying to do at the Conservation Institute?
Sure. The Conserving Modern Architecture Initiative was started a couple years ago now, March 2012. And the program was really meant to through research and work, develop a program of investigation and analysis for the advancement and conservation of modern heritage. It was really felt that what we really need to do was build synergies with other programs at the Getty Conservation Institute. For example, our Contemporary Art Initiative, which was really looking at materials from the 20th century and artwork. And so what we thought would be really great is if we could also take that same knowledge and apply it to architecture. And so that's how the program started in the genesis. And what we've been doing over the last year or so is we've been really looking at the field and trying to identify gaps in terms of what knowledge might be needed. And so we've been working a lot with different organizations, meeting with a lot of institutions and people to really kind of really examine, you know, what are the things that we could do that would help to advance conservation practice internationally. Our program is an international one. It's one of those things where we have the resources to be able to provide the benefit to a number of areas of research that would advance conservation practice. I think there has been a lot of discussion over 2 decades, a period of time, where many organizations have been looking at the challenges that have come up in the field. For example, you have organizations, local organizations, governmental organizations, international organizations like Docomomo, who really got started early on with looking at an array of different subjects that people were dealing with in the 20th century. Our idea was to kind of build synergies with those organizations and institutions and to try to kind of identify what the needs of the field were. So our program really kind of stands on some pillars, if you will, of interest that we'd like to build upon. One is just, as I mentioned, kind of looking at what the needs of the field are and meeting with people and professionals to find out what that is. And the other is research. Through work and research work and investigation, we're hoping to really look at material issues, challenges in material conservation. What are the things that people are faced with that are challenging? One of those things that we might look at, for example, is looking at concrete, which is something that many buildings of the 20th century were built out of. So it's a huge area of research that we think would, you know, be beneficial to look at. Through that research, we're also looking at field projects, and one of our first field projects is the Eames House Conservation Project, wherein we were able to partner with the Eames Foundation to kind of really bring the knowledge and expertise to really look at new ways of approaching conservation that would help build on the body of information that already exists there. So we've been engaged with the Eames Foundation, as you know, for the last 2 years in looking at the site and trying to develop a conservation management plan that would help them plan for the future care of the house in the future. Some of the other areas that we're also involved in are training and education. I think that as we work in field projects, we want to be able to take some of the things that we learn and apply it to training and education program, which then might yield some resources that then could be used by practitioners in the field. All of these things sort of one building on the other to kind of advance the field in a direction to help people in this particular area. And the last thing that I think a lot of people are familiar with, which is something we've been doing the last couple of years, is just really trying to have a public programming initiative that where we can sort of interact with professionals and try to bring in their projects and case studies and things that they're working on in order to you know, disseminate that information to people locally and internationally through video recordings and things on the web. So there's quite a bit going on, but that's basically the framework for the program. And, you know, I think there's a lot to do.
Well, I think the issues of materiality in conservation of modern resources in particular are tricky and thorny. I know that we talk a lot about it in our classes in terms of what is conservation and what is replication and what is Is it a brand new building, or is it a place that is no longer authentic anymore after a certain, where do you reach the tipping point where it's not historic anymore? And we have that conversation a lot. It drives my students bananas. But I would say that that's a conversation that's happening all the time across the board in many of the issues that each of you are confronting in your projects. So, Chris, do you want to talk a little bit about your work on Prentice and about the Astrodome?
What would you like to know? Where do I begin?
All right, so let's focus on the Astrodome. So this being LA and many people who are not necessarily from even the United States here, maybe you can talk a little bit about the Astrodome and what it is and why it's significant and what are the issues confronting it and where things are headed.
I can talk a little bit about it. I'll be honest, this was not my project, so I'm speaking sort of second or third hand here. But as you did a good job of explaining, it was sort of considered to be the eighth wonder of the world at the time that it was built in the 60s. It still kind of boggles the mind that it was a retractable dome of the scale that it was. I mean, the fact that that thing moved and allowed it to be opened up to the sky, and as you sort of what you listed, the list of firsts that have happened there. And I think in many ways it was significant not only for kind of the engineering and the architectural wonder that it presented, but also because so many people, like I was saying earlier, had really deep connections to that place because, of what games that they saw there. And I think that's kind of very specific to venues. You have a really great memories of what you saw there, who you were with, that particular moment in time, and so you'll connect to that place around an event as opposed to necessarily around the building itself. It was faced with demolition because there was a new stadium that was built literally right next door. I mean, almost on top of this poor thing. So it ceased to serve its original function as a baseball stadium and a venue when the new baseball stadium was built right next door. And that was sort of the first signal that the future was not bright for this place. And what it boiled down to actually was a very kind of political battle. There was a referendum, which thank goodness it went to a referendum, but they gave the public an opportunity to kind of speak out in terms of whether they wanted to try to help fund a bond to continue some kind of use for this or whether they did not. And unfortunately, that referendum was not successful, but it was an incredibly close vote. And I think there's a lot of discussion just in terms of strategy about whether that was the right timing for that referendum. If you read Christopher Hawthorne's article, he really kind of talks about how that referendum maybe could have played out in a different way if it had been handled at a different time in terms of the political season. So really kind of thinking through that aspect of the strategy may have had a different result. It's still standing, as you mentioned. The pieces of the building that have been demolished are not sort of the most significant elements of it. They were later additions. And the last that I have heard on it, it's owned by Harris County in Houston. And so the 5 county commissioners kind of get to decide the fate of this building right now. And they have said that they want to hear still more from the public. No one's quite sure what that means, but they don't seem to be champing at the bit to just go ahead and follow the results of the vote and tear it down. And so we're still kind of waiting to understand exactly what that means, but it sounds like there may be more opportunities to kind of make a stronger case for the potential for a reuse, probably some kind of public-private partnership, as opposed to expecting, the taxpayers to foot the entire bill for this thing. So that's where it's
So if you need an enormous stadium in Houston, there's an opportunity for you here. I think it's apropos, certainly, of the conversation today on NPR about the reopening of the Forum here in Los Angeles, which was also threatened with demolition when the Staples Center was built and was perceived as outdated and outmoded and not useful, and now has a new life. And so not all the stories are sad. That's a good one. And so that's a sort of good local example. But I think sports stadiums are in particular a very tricky issue.
They are tough. I mean, it really does kind of boil down, as many things do, but in this particular instance, it boils down to the economics. And so really kind of looking at the feasibility of reuse of something of this scale and how you would make that pencil out is a big challenge.
It's not a small building, just in case you're wondering. So Adrian, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the things that are going on here in Los Angeles, more close to home?
In terms of good, bad?
Mm-hmm.
everything?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a broad.
Modern resource advocacy here in LA. What are some of the current issues that the Conservancy is working on?
One of the things that Conservancy has been probably at this game of talking about modernism, and I say that through the Conservancy, but really at the nudging and urging and pestering of our Modern Committee, and I mean that in a good way. Our Modern Committee is this year celebrating 30 years in existence, and that tells you a lot about where Los Angeles has been, whereas most places around the country maybe are just now starting to talk about it, or just within the last 5 or 10 years, which is good, that we've been having this discussion, and it's an evolving discussion about what we care about, what's important to Los Angeles. And one of the things that we did in this last year was through, thank you, with Getty support, we're able to launch a new website and a whole new kind of approach looking at modernism in LA. And Alan Hess and the audience really kind of framed the context for modernism in LA in a really clever way of breaking it down by themes, but also by decades, because it's really interesting in the way in LA how it's evolved. But looking at places that we care about and that are significant and important from 1940 up to 1990, which, who would think that something from the 70s or 80s is important? But I think that's part of our job as preservationists, and we typically are react. And so part of that process, it forced us to start thinking about, and Trudy was part of this process, saying, well, what is important from the 1980s? What was happening during that period? We did that tour in Venice, and it was really, I think, great in terms of thinking about, the artist movement that was happening there, around the architects, around the built environment, around the murals, all the things that were kind of swirling around in that place during that time frame. And then we were thinking, we're going to do this tour. Who's going to show up? Will they care? And we had a great turnout, and people did care, and they are interested in that period of history. And this is where I agree with Chris. They remember it, and they think it was very exciting. It was really important. So I think we are increasingly going in that direction, talking about places that are now threatened from the 70s, and figuring out how we're going to approach it and how we're going to get both the people that care about these places, but also where's the political support, because that's where the rubber hits the road. We can care about these places, but if the politics don't pan out or the economics don't pan out, we're going to lose some really significant places, and I think that's where we're headed on some places that we're talking about. But we've had some success. I mean, Century Plaza Hotel, I think we've talked a lot about it. We were all involved in it. And it was one of those great stories that I don't think anybody anticipated it would have quite the turnaround that it did, going from complete demolition to saving the hotel and still allowing the new development to occur. So it's the classic, as we say all the time, the win-win. It's not pure preservation by any means. So we were malleable in terms of it's not preserving Century Plaza Hotel as an amber or museum piece. It's allowing it to change. I think other things that more recently happened, Johnny's Coffee Shop. Who doesn't love that place? It's probably one of the most beloved places, I think, in LA, and I think it's, again, people have personal connection to it. People love the architecture. People know that place, and but it is threatened in terms of its future use, in terms of what Metro was thinking about that site. And it was important to preserve. So, I mean, we've got things like that. We've got Hannah Carter Japanese Garden. Isn't just about buildings, it's about landscapes. And that's a designed landscape mid-century that UCLA is proposing to sell off with no protections. And that's been going on for several years now in terms of advocating for its stewardship and long-term protection. But it's also looking at landscapes, I dare to say, Pershing Square. Postmodernism. I don't know. I saw some grimaces already on people's faces out there, like, oh my God. I don't know if people are going to rally around their fond moments of Pershing Square or from,
Show of hands. Show of hands. Anyone?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But it's up for grabs in terms of what might happen there, especially after all the success that's happened with Grand Park, that's now the target to kind of think through about how can we make Pershing Square a vibrant public space, but does the postmodern layering that's on there today, is that important? Do people care about? Will anybody fight for it?
Yeah. So is show of hands, postmodernism, is that modernism? Yeah. All right. So lots of nods. Who says no? Yeah, no one's willing to say no. Okay. There has been some debate about whether postmodernism fits into the rubric of modern resource conservation, or if it's, so different that it can't be in the same conversation.
Another Momo.
Yes, it's POMOMO, which has been, a whole different conversation, and really requires some drinks, I think, to have that conversation.
I have a question for Adrian. So, Adrian, I'm very curious to know what you find are the most successful examples and maybe not so successful examples, and how you were able to engage the public to create a better understanding of places that would sort of, provide some awareness about how to save the place and why it's important. I mean, what are some of the things that you've done or tools that you've used to kind of, spur that along? Because you've mentioned a lot of really good examples. I'm just curious to know what you find is really successful in terms of some of the methodologies and tools that you use to get people on board with things.
Well, we've learned a lot through this process.
Yeah.
Some have been kind of guerrilla techniques, and I would say the Downey McDonald's, and that was ModCom, our modern committee, staging a protest with, Speedy physically stabbing Ronald McDonald in the back with the McGreedy corporate types holding their coffins. It's not something we would traditionally do, but it got the media attention, and it was that kind of blip. Sometimes you need that, and sometimes where the 11 most endangered places listing is so helpful is it gets the attention of folks. But I think part of it is being able to tell a story, and sometimes it's hard for these places, but sometimes it is easy because it is something that people can immediately get. It's more, I think, accessible. Some of this architecture from this period is accessible. We know it, and therefore it doesn't take a lot to get over the hump to understand and why it's important. And also, as more and more that we lose, they became, it's easier to understand that they're rare and that they're vulnerable. But I think the other thing that we work really hard at the Conservancy is, again, to find that middle ground. What's proposed, what exists there now, and how can you maybe achieve both? And so, I think Cinerama Dome is a really great example of just that, where what they were proposing originally there was to encase the dome, which, why would you do that? But how can you still do the development there in a way that's sensitive to the building in scale and character and still achieve, the two things? So, I think that's part of it.
I think that's so relevant because I think oftentimes as preservationists, and this is not just with modern architecture, but when we're talking about saving places and buildings, it's important to offer solutions. And when people have an opportunity to envision a solution, it becomes part of the process. So I think that's really important.
Absolutely. I mean, we try to be more of the group that says yes, or try to say yes more than we say no. I don't know if we actually achieve that, but we try. I mean, that's our goal. But I think there's some really challenging things ahead for all of us in this arena. It's around sustainability in these places. Some of them don't, pass muster in that area. Some do. But I think that's a big issue here, that it's another thing we have to deal with. I think densification is probably a bigger one. In some ways it works for us because a lot of these buildings maybe have a big surface parking lot which can accommodate some new development, so you can get that win-win. Sometimes that's not the case and they're low scaled, and so the pressure as well, we need to have more density. Density is always good. That's the perception. Unless we're talking about McMansions and the tear down scenario, there's no density there, it's just bigger houses, so it doesn't really pan out in terms of the argument there. One thing I mentioned before, I'd just like to tease a little bit more, is that the issue of Tower Records in West Hollywood, where ultimately it came down, I think where it is right now, is that there wasn't enough there.
Can you describe it a little bit for those who may not be familiar? Tower
Records, West Hollywood. It was historically located in essentially a strip mall, shopping center. Very dominant in terms of its signage and paint, yellow and red stripes. You couldn't miss it. But it was important not just for, this is where Tower Records began, but it was a place where, Tower Records, a lot of major cultural events, people, happened in this space. Tower Records left how many years ago? Anybody? 10 years ago. Since then, the building's been painted over. Signage is gone. Is it still historic or not? And that was up for debate in West Hollywood and saying, integrity, issues like that, and is it important that building in terms of the Tower Records story? I would, and I'm not judging one way or another on that one necessarily, but I will throw another one out there as an example, also kind of recent past history, the Black Cat, who a lot of you know, maybe Black Cat is in Silver Lake. Relatively undistinguished 1920s building, I believe it is, right on Sunset. Very important in terms of demonstrations that happened there as part of the LGBT community, and even before Stonewall in New York. And important in terms of cultural significance, building, nice building, but nothing that would stand out. And that passed muster in terms of the city of Los Angeles and it becoming a historic cultural landmark. There's nothing inside remaining from the Black Cat era days. It's largely a sign and the place in which it happened. So is that different than Tower Records? Are they the same story? I'm just saying this is one of the challenges that we have as preservationists, and also saying what do we save, what do we pass on, and are we being consistent in how we apply criteria and approaches?
Can I add on? I mean, I think that's a really good point, and it's something that has kind of bothered me, is I feel like we oftentimes get in our own way a lot of times, particularly in terms of how we define what we think is significant. And I'm not just saying we, the people on this stage, I think preservationists, and particularly sort of the professional preservation movement, we're oftentimes sort of stuck in these little boxes of this is how you are going to define significance, and this is why this place is going to be significant. And I think in a lot of times we not only end up kind of cutting out some very important pieces of history and culture, but we also end up alienating huge groups of people who may, like you were saying, who may have a very particular interest in that place, and it may have real resonance for them. And so I'm trying to ask the question of how do we do a better job as a preservation movement of trying to not only recognize but also respect these places and the layers of meaning that they may have to people, whether they're modern sites with a capital M or whether they occurred in sort of the modern era, however you want to define it. But I think we need to be much more inclusive in the way that we're looking at these things and respecting the significance that other people are applying to them as opposed to just applying our own criteria to them. I think that's really the only way we're going to stay relevant as a movement, quite honestly.
Well, and I think one of the things that I see walking through the halls here in the School of Architecture is a lot of these buildings. For instance, last semester I was walking through and there was a studio that was done about how to create a metro portal where Johnny's is. And, of course, I was like, wait a minute. That Johnny's can't go anywhere. What are you talking about? But the whole studio concept was about how to totally erase that history, or to gut the building and have the portal come out of the building, and all the creative and interesting things that architecture students and designers get to do as sort of theoretical constructs without really thinking about the reality of what's there and is it historic and what is the context of the place that's in existence. So I think that to some degree the work on this issue needs to start here while people are thinking about these things and putting it in the context of design, learning about these places and spaces in the context of their history, and that it's not just about only architecture, that there are other layers to these stories, and I think we have to do a better job at making sure that message gets out. And I know I'm preaching to the choir because these are a lot of friendly faces in the audience, but I do think that this will live on the website, and I think it's important to know that that our legacy here, starting here at the School of Architecture, needs to be one of helping these buildings evolve and become relevant into the future. And so, Kyle, did you have one more thing you wanted to mention?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that within the context of this discussion, this is a challenge not just locally or nationally, but internationally. One of the initiatives that we've been involved with for example, with the 20th Century Committee on Ecomos, is to really look at a historic framework for how you determine significance of place. And this is something that really needs to happen for the 20th century, and it's a need in the field, and it will require rigorous research to be able to develop a framework that people can use and adapt on a local level. Because without a framework for assessment, it's difficult to really understand what the significance of place is, especially when you have multifaceted layers of history and complexity like you do in the 20th century.
All right. Well, we've talked a lot. Now we'd like to hear from you. Do you have questions? We'd like to open it up for discussion. Barbara? It may not reach.
I don't want to stand up.
Might need to.
One idea about Johnny's and places like that, and responding to Chris's ideas about significance, would be to maybe collect narratives that people have about a particular place, so that they have an opportunity to say, hey, my thing is about sports. It's nothing to do with the architecture or that team or whatever, or that soda that I had there. So those kinds of narratives, they start to snowball. I was talking about Orange County and just raising a concern to all of us. The Orange Coast College campus, or the original campus, it was designed by Neutra and Alexander, and it's a wonderful embodiment of how to use materials and low buildings and integrate it with a site that was, the landscape and hardscape was designed by Garrett Ekbo. And there's so much happening there in terms of Neutra's ideals, and it's completely below the radar. And that all stands to be, all the classrooms that are set so beautifully into the landscape are to be demolished to create an open quad. So that was the second thing I wanted to mention. And the third thing was I do think that postmodernism is different than modernism and deserves its own separate track, and it's not a modernist thing. And happy to have a drink on that.
Sounds like a plan. All right. Other questions for the panel?
Well, before the question, I'll make a brief comment about postmodernism. I think one of the great traditions of preservation has been not being biased about style, but caring about meaning and culture and quality, and I think that ought to continue. And so everything by the same name isn't alike, and we might make those distinctions. Now, the question I really have is, especially in relation to the exhibit, in which many of the projects are really beautifully whole places, not architecture as an object, but as a set of spaces, including those outside and inside. And so I wonder whether there is more interest these days in whole places rather than in what I consider to be the object-mindedness of architectural preservation, which was about the material and the object, but not necessarily the place or maybe even the culture.
Yes.
Yes.
There's a couple of things. I mean, especially this era of resources, it was total design. I mean in a different way than sometimes we say it, but it was about the landscape. It was about the way you interacted within the space, but also approaching the space. It was about the interior design. It was about lots of different things, and then you add the layer of what happened there, and the cultural aspects or socioeconomic aspects that might plug into that as well. Are really, it's what makes these places, I think, even more interesting and having more dimension to them. But I think it gets to that, some of what you're talking about is kind of intangible. And I will throw out one of the places that we're advocating for, and we have been advocating for, I think we're going on year 8 now, and I wouldn't say it's modern in terms of what we often think of modern, but it's all about modern living, and that's Wyvernwood in Boyle Heights garden apartment. It was all about new way of living, modern way of living, but it was all about, you know, how you interact with your neighbors and you have a better, healthier, more complete life in terms of, because you get to know each other and the way in which the buildings are placed and the landscape, it really fosters that, where design fosters community. And it's, I think, LA, we think, is the second largest collection of garden apartments in the country, and Wyvernwood is a place that's completely at risk right now with total redevelopment. But the people that live there today, they're another layer on the history of a place, and it's their home, and it's a place where they've met their spouses, and, you know, some have lived there 20, 30 years, and it gets beyond just buildings and landscape into something that this place has created, and that is a culture, and a culture that has thrived in large part because of the design. So I think it's sometimes these intangibles that, while the buildings themselves may not look all that, you know, special, and it looks a little rundown because it hasn't been maintained, the real story there is what that place has fostered and created, and that's what I think in some ways what we're trying to save, more so than just, you know, bricks and mortar. So I think it gets at, the ways in which we advocate for places is quite broad, and it should be.
I mean, I think that's exactly right. I think in many cases, I mean, Barbara was alluding to it with the examples in Orange County, and that is that, you know, the architecture of the time really was designed integral with the setting and the landscape. And I think, you know, over time, especially the way places are depicted, whether they're photographed in a particular way, that, you know, oftentimes we objectify the architecture. But, for example, what we found in the Eames house and just in our model field study is that that Charles and Ray Eames actually preserved the landscape when they built the house. It was very intentional, and there was a whole evolution with that site and the eucalyptus trees and everything. So I think there's a lot of that going on with regards to, well, in particular with domestic architecture, but in particular with institutional architecture and large-scale architecture as well, whether, you know, the hardscape is designed as an integral part of the architecture, or whether it's the natural setting to which the architecture resides in. They're one and the same, and I think it's important to think of it that way.
I'm going to open my mouth, and I'm probably going to regret it because I'm going to be the contrarian here. I completely agree that, you know, those holistic design places are incredibly important, not only because of what, you know, the design intent there, but also sort of what happens in those spaces, like you were saying. But I think as we find, you know, saving an individual place is a challenge in and of itself. Like trying to get, you know, find a viable reuse for an individual building or an individual site can often be an almost Herculean task in and of itself, because you often have to accommodate change. And I think that just becomes exponentially more difficult when you're talking about these collections of places in which you're looking at so many different integrated aspects, including multiple buildings and the landscapes. Trying to preserve the purity of that becomes, I think, that much more complicated when you're talking about a collection or a site or a designed, you know, landscape in that way that contains a collection of buildings and interiors. And so it just, I think, given the economic pressures and the development pressures, it just becomes a very, very difficult prospect. I'm not saying it's not a worthwhile prospect. I'm just saying the reality is it makes it very, very difficult to do.
It's a complex world we live in, and I think that regardless of the era of the site or resource, that we as a collective discipline are thinking much more holistically now than we used to. It used to really be about the object, and now it's much more about the setting and the site and things. That's more than just lip service, and is much more than certainly it used to be. And I think that we certainly talk about it a lot in the context of our own work here at school, but I see that in the professional world as well. So that is a delightful thing to know that we too are evolving and changing, and that our discipline is growing to be able to accommodate a much broader range of resources and a much more nuanced and layered sense of history and time and change over time. So that's exciting, I think, personally. Other questions? Okay. So thank you, everyone, so much for coming. I really appreciate it.